Hey folks, this is the second part of a two-part interview with Restoration News investigative researcher Jacob Grandstaff on the DSA and Zohran Mamdani. Catch part one in the show notes, and without further ado, this is Restoration Spotlight. I think that follows logically. Okay, we have mass immigration. This is the second era of mass immigration in U.S. history. Okay, but this time it's from places that have even less in common. There's no Christian heritage there. So there's some parallels, but it is quite a bit different because you don't have some of the worldview assumptions. For instance, like Islamic tradition has no sense of secular government. There's no separation between mosque and state because that's a Christian idea. It cannot be applied to Islam without breaking Islamic theology. Okay, so you have a huge number of people coming in since 9/11 who are coming in like this. Couple that with the left's success in creating multiculturalism, right? Even the argument, often misapplied argument of we're a nation of immigrants, America's an idea. Well, no, it's a real country. My ancestors have been here since Jamestown, where they're not an idea, they're real people. It has a real heritage just like any other country here. Okay, but multiculturalism, as the left has done it, is the opposite of assimilation. When you bring those two things in here, you end up with self-rule in Dearborn, in parts of New York City, just like we're seeing in Europe. And you're saying the first evidence that self-rule, right, is happening after decades of this kind of multicultural mass immigration is that they want to have their own laws to apply to themselves. It's not that we become Sharia, burqa-wearing people tomorrow. It's that they do, and they're allowed to try their own, which is an indication that they don't have fealty to the United States government the way you and I do. And from there, if it continues to grow, it does actually become we are under their jurisdiction next.
Because why would they have any respect for the Constitution, which is based on English common law?
Yes, that's
English
right.
common law.
And Christian assumptions, yes.
Right. They have no interest in following something like that. They view their way of life as superior to ours. They view their religion as superior to ours, and everything about their culture is superior to ours. So, and whenever they view their civilization as superior to ours, they're naturally going to import their culture from other countries. They're going to have no interest in adopting our ways of life. And a key difference between the immigration from Ellis Island and the immigration today is those people coming to the United States didn't have an intrinsic hatred of the West and America.
No, certainly not. They were escaping to find something new.
Right, exactly. Yes. They're trying to find something better. These people, they're just here for the money. Yeah. They're here for the money, and they want to build their civilization on our shores.
I think one of the differences, too, is people who came here, like a lot of our ancestors 100 years ago, were coming at a time where America had a lot of opportunity, a lot of room to grow, a lot of free jobs, and real self-confidence. It was a muscular nation with a real sense of common destiny. And actually, a lot of that came from the post-Civil War tightening of bonds and unity. I remember reading an account of a traveler from France in the 1880s, 2 decades after the Civil War ends, the worst division we'd seen to that point, saying, I've never seen a country so united in its sense of purpose. Mm-hmm. We don't have that in the 2020s. You have a real bifurcation between people who want to obliterate the country on the left and people who are searching for that common purpose on the right. So when you have immigrants come today, what's the incentive to want to be part of that project? As opposed to, you come here to plunder the country, mm-hmm, to make a buck and go back home. Growing up in California, I remember distinctly watching how particular East Asian immigrants from China, from a lot of countries, but especially China, were never invested in the political future of the country. Irishmen were. The second they got off the boat 100 years ago, they were deeply involved, even if it was corrupt through Tammany Hall. They saw themselves as, we're going to make something of ourselves, we're here. Chinese immigrants in California only got involved when there was a man with a Chinese surname on the ticket. And that's interesting. That tells you, and I think it also makes sense, the West has traditions of citizen involvement, even in empires like the British Empire, citizens trying to assert self-rule and independence like the Irishmen, right? That's never been the case in the Middle East or East Asia.
And that's why it took Mamdani being on the ballot for Muslims to turn out in force. Because beforehand, it was like, why would I vote for any of these people?
Exactly.
What are they going to do for my community? Now, Mamdani comes along, speaks to them in their language. He's Muslim like they are. It's like, okay, well, he's our boy.
Yeah.
He's our man. We're going to.
So let's talk about, you mentioned Mahmoud Mamdani, his father. Let's talk about this, because one of the things you've written about is this really eerie parallel between Mahmoud, the father, and Barack Obama's father. Not the same man, but this idea of a foreign socialist thinker, right, who has these dreams that seem to be put into practice by his son in the United States. I might be stretching the comparison here, but let's talk a little bit about Mahmoud.
So let's imagine. So Mahmoud only came to the United States because of a foreign exchange program with John F. Kennedy. John F. Kennedy was allowing people from the third world to come and study in America. So let's imagine a world in which Zohran Mamdani is not the mayor of New York City. All it takes is John F. Kennedy not inviting third worlders to come study at our universities.
Where did he come from?
He came from Uganda. So he came from Uganda. He came and studied engineering in America. He was going to be an engineer. And at the time, it was during the 60s. So our universities are Marxist hotbeds. Everything is politicized. So he decides to give up engineering and focus on political science. He gets involved in the civil rights marches, and he was actually jailed. And he called the ambassador from Uganda and complained. And the Ugandan ambassador said, "What are you doing getting involved in politics?" It's like, yeah,
you're supposed to be an engineer.
It's like, you're supposed to be a guest in this country studying engineering. Why are you getting involved in their politics? And so it's our system created Zohran Mamdani. So our system, by allowing third worlders to come and study, because we were trying to help these people, we figured in our arrogance, we assumed that they would see the wonders of America, the wonders of the free market system, and it would just be obvious to them, self-evident, that yes, I need to adopt this. But no, of course not. People have pride in who they are, even if they come from a mud hut, and they're going to try to build their people up, or more so than the people that opened their arms to them.
Let me pause you for a second, though, just because it's a little bit confusing. He's not African. He's not black.
Correct.
So Mahmoud is actually from, now we would call it Pakistan, but the Indian subcontinent. He was a Muslim from the Indian subcontinent who moved to Uganda when he was a young man. Help me with the history. I believe he was born in Uganda. I believe his parents. Okay. There were a lot of British subjects from the Indian subcontinent who moved to Uganda for railroad purposes and work.
Yes, and it's still an issue. There's still a big problem with the prejudice between Indians and Native Africans now to this day because of their descendants in a lot of those countries. But he goes back to Africa now as a Pan-Africanist. He's no longer an engineer aspirant. He's now a Pan-Africanist. He's been politicized in America, and then he gets kicked out of Uganda by Idi Amin
because he's not black.
Because Idi Amin's like, hey, post-colonialism means we restore our nation to what it was before the Europeans arrived, and the Europeans brought you people.
You're one of them. Yes, that's
out
right.
You go.
I love that irony.
And what's amazing is, where does he go when he gets kicked out? He goes to England. The English embrace him with open arms. They give him spots to teach at their universities. He's able to further his education and further his career. And does he repay his time in America with gratitude toward the West? Does he repay his time in England with gratitude toward the West? Of course not. He devotes his entire career to undermining Westernism and Western colonialism. And he goes so far, he makes the same argument that Edward Said makes. Edward Said blamed all the problems of the Middle East on the West. Like all the tribal warfare, the despotism. Oh, that's because they learned it from the West. Right. Mahmoud Mamdani does the exact same thing. He basically, his whole thesis is the tribalism and the brutality and the non-democracy in Africa is because the Western powers came in and just disrupted natural life as it was and disrupted their form of government. And they basically adopted the autocratic means of their colonizers. And so his whole career is based on demonizing the West that opened its arms and educated him, furthered his career, gave him a career, and embraced him after he was kicked out of his native Uganda.
So what's kind of funny about this actually is we started by talking about don't use outdated Cold War, slurs against this guy because they're not going to land with young people who don't remember it. But actually, when you explain his history here, Zohran's a young man. I mean, I think we're about the same age, early 30s. But if you look at his father and understand him as an extension of his father, no, this really is Cold War Soviet influence on the third world. That was a massive part. And actually, I believe that was the reason that Kennedy had that program, was to win, the third world, which is called the third world because it's not aligned with the Soviet Union or the first world.
Correct.
That's what the Soviets were the second world.
Winning hearts and minds, that was the goal. And as a result, I'm sure there were lots of Africans who loved America. They
became doctors, not political activists.
Exactly, but that's the key. They became mechanics, doctors, engineers. They didn't use their pen to express their ideology or their love for the West or America. They came and did what they were supposed to do, what they planned to do. And then the revolutionaries, I don't know that he's Marxist, but he definitely is. He was greatly used by the Soviet Union, and he aligned with the Soviet Union's anti-colonial, post-colonial viewpoint that demonized all Western colonialism. And then you get, his son being mayor in 2025. It's the natural result of that.
I want to close out by talking about the apparatus that helped elect Mamdani, the Democratic Socialists of America, DSA. This is something that a lot of listeners will be familiar with because they're growing as a political force, yet they remain fringe. And I'm not sure if there's a good comparison on the right. Tea Party seems too grassroots to me. This is really more of a concentrated clique of elites, people who are well-funded, but they're not coming out of like the big philanthropy machine that the Democratic Party relies on, George Soros types. They're way closer almost to like a Communist Party USA or an insurrectionist cell that's operating across the country. So let's start by talking about the DSA. What's its origins? Is it comparable to like the Communist Party USA from 60, 70 years ago? And how is it growing in power over the last, especially 15 years?
So the DSA is actually more dangerous, in my opinion, than the Communist Party USA was, because their goal is to work within the Democratic Party, and they will vote for third parties. They'll endorse third party candidates, but they will work within the Democratic Party where and when they can. CPUSA didn't do that. The Democratic Party and the labor unions were constantly at odds with the CPUSA.
They wanted to replace the Democratic Party.
Correct. They wanted
both parties.
Exactly.
Yes.
They wanted ultimately communist revolution. So to go back to the origins of DSA, it was founded in 1982 by a merger between two separate organizations. You had the Democratic Socialist Organizing Committee, which was headed by Michael Harrington, and then you had the New America movement, and that was headed by a group of mostly former communists who had been disillusioned with communism and had kind of tacked to the right a little bit. They weren't as radical. They didn't want revolution. Michael Harrington had been a lifelong anti-communist, but he was a socialist, and he wanted to bring socialism to the United States through the democratic process. And early on, he started with the LBJ movement. He was a big influencer. He actually wrote a book in 1962 that influenced LBJ's war on poverty. Oh. And he knew LBJ personally. He actually lectured for the State Department. He worked with multiple government organizations, Harrington did. But it was because he believed that you could bring socialism to America through the Democratic Party. And he believed that the Democratic Party was further enough to the left where with enough patience and persistence, you could elect socialists. And this, of course, alienated communists. And the DSA stayed small throughout the 1980s. They had 6,000, 7,000 members. He ended up endorsing Michael Dukakis, mainstream Democrats. He did not endorse Jesse Jackson because he felt Jesse Jackson was too liberal. And he dies in 1989, and the organization almost dies out because the 90s is the era of Bill Clinton, neoliberalism, communists are a thing of the past. It experiences a little bit of a resurgence after the Iraq War because that gives the left something to rally around.
An anti-war movement.
Yes, and they endorsed John Kerry, and John Kerry is like the first candidate that they actually nominate or rally around and unite behind. But it still stays small. They have the average age is 68 in 2013, and Bernie Sanders is what breathes life into the movement, the campaign of Bernie Sanders in 2016. So the average age in 2013 is 68. In 2017, the average age is 33. They shoot up from about 6,000, 7,000 members in 2014 to almost 100,000 by 2021. And it's because of the Bernie movement. You had a lot of millennials who had been educated in the liberal arts in our universities. They leaned left. They were favorable toward Marxism. And when Bernie Sanders came along, they supported him, and DSA was very good at recruiting them into their movement.
But critically, did it change? I mean, is it really just still a 1960s in what it aims to achieve, for instance? Because it just seems to me it's warmed over 1960s Marxism with a new face, and Bernie is the guy who made that happen. Or did it really change?
Well, it never was Marxist. So it was always
okay. Help me with that.
So Michael Harrington was not a Marxist. In fact, he remained Catholic his entire life, and he tried his best to convince communists that Karl Marx really wasn't as radical as he was, and that Karl Marx really didn't hate religion like they thought he did. So he was a socialist. He was not a revolutionary, and he wanted to bring democratic socialism to the United States through the democratic process. And the DSA has pretty much remained unchanged in its mission and its goal since the 1980s. The only difference is Bernie Sanders. Bernie Sanders managed to boost their membership. Their goal remains to bring socialism through the democratic process, through the ballot box.
Okay, I've been using Marxism and socialism interchangeably. Are you referring to, with Marxism, the more traditional, the worker sees the means of production,
Yes,
there's no private property?
Right. The DSA does not want to bring that kind of radical Marxism.
I see.
Want to socialize healthcare. They want to socialize housing. They want to socialize, basic amenities. Instead of having welfare, let's frame it this way. Instead of having welfare, they just want to have socialism where we currently have welfare. Where we currently have government intervention, they just want to replace it with a collectivist socialist
But they're
system.
informed, they have a Marxist way of looking at things are all power, it's economic, there's haves and have-nots, but maybe it's more like, the long march through the institutions where it's cultural Marxism. Maybe that's more applicable.
Yeah, that's definitely it. I mean, Harrington was influenced by Gramsci, and that's definitely their viewpoint, is that you can gradually bring socialism, and they've been relatively successful. I think they have 250 elected officials who are DSA members today. Lee Carter, he was one of the first, he was a delegate in Virginia, Northern Virginia, got elected in 2017. In 2017, they had dozens. That was the first year they actually had dozens of members elected.
In less than a decade, from dozens to 250.
Yes, correct. And now they've met with some serious resistance from the Democratic Party. Over 90% of the Democratic Socialist candidates, whether they were DSA supported or not, have lost primaries to mainstream Democrats. But with Zohran Mamdani getting elected, that's just going to breathe more life into them and encourage them. Some of the major ones are Rashida Tlaib, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez.
Jasmine Crockett, right?
That's a good question. I'm not sure if she's DSA. She may be.
The squad is all DSA. The four women, right? She's not one of them, but yes, Ilhan Omar.
Yes, Ilhan Omar. But yes, they have seen some moderate success. I feel like the election of Zohran Mamdani is just going to radicalize them further and push them, because now they see they have the numbers.
It's the biggest scalp they've ever claimed.
Correct, and they realize that if they can build their coalition between basically Marxist-educated yuppies who hate capitalism. Maybe they're not full-blown revolutionaries, but they hate capitalism. They don't believe in it. And the immigrant communities from Asia and the Middle East, and then if they can radicalize Hispanics through all the ICE raids and everything like that, then they see a coalition that they could potentially build. And here's the main takeaway I think that the right needs to have about this is there's not much we can do. There's very little we can do with the immigration other than stopping it from coming in. Like the immigrants who are here, they are going to gravitate toward their own kind. There's very little we can do about that.
So don't feed that.
Exactly. There's very little we can do about the liberal arts educated yuppies. They are dyed-in-the-wool socialists. They will be socialists till the day they die. Getting married isn't going to de-radicalize them.
Paying taxes doesn't
turn
them into conservatives.
Owning business, they already own businesses. They opened all their own little craft breweries. That didn't de-radicalize them. The one demographic that we should make sure that we do not give up is the working class, because there are a lot of generational Americans who are working service industry jobs, who are having to live out of a hotel room, who are having to live in homeless shelters, who go to work every day. They work 40 to 50 hours a week and they can't afford rent. And this is the demographic that is most susceptible to saying, you know what, forget America, forget capitalism. These people are offering a better life to me. I'm going to give my vote to them. And keeping these people out of the Democratic Socialist tent, I feel like should be the number one task of the Trump coalition of the Republican Party, which is trying to build a working class base, because these people are susceptible. They're struggling. Their lives are miserable. Most of them are unmarried, childless, and they have no future. And creating a future for them within the right of the political spectrum, it should be our number one goal.
They're atomized. They don't have community, so they are susceptible to lies about fake communities, the community of the world. Okay, I want to take stock for a moment here because there's a lot to unpack. All right. So the natural comparison a lot of people are going to want to make is this is an updated CPUSA. This is an updated Communist Party. No, because the Communist Party was literally founded by a guy traveling from Moscow in the 1920s with a handbag full of cash, and it was always a foreign organization dependent on a foreign government. DSA is different. It's homegrown. It has a unique, I'm going to use the word Marxism, it has a uniquely American form of Marxism that's very cultural and appeals to a country that is very immigrant focused in a way that the Soviet Russia never could be, okay? So that's a different thing. It also works within the Democratic Party structure. So you and I have talked offline about this, but the way a DSA candidate will run for the Portland, Oregon City Council is going to be overt, loud socialism. I'm representing the DSA. The way they'll run in even New York City is somewhat through the Democratic Party apparatus that's already established there. And of course, the more tight an election would be, like, a North Carolina Senate race, there's no way they're running as a third party. They're running as much as they can to take over the Democratic Party apparatus in there. So you're saying critically, you win first by stopping that process. Don't let the Democrats become what the DSA would turn them into, right?
Well, we have a precedent for this in the 80s. We stopped that in the 80s. Because this was Harrington's goal in the 1980s to do what Bernie Sanders has accomplished so far. And he failed because the Republican Party was strong enough to beat that back. The moderate Democrats couldn't win elections.
They were blue dogs. Yeah, they could win that.
Right. So what he did, rather than becoming a pariah, is he basically just moderated his positions to become a mainstream Democrat. But he was always a socialist. His people were always socialist. And so we're never going to completely eradicate socialism from the body politic. That's never going to happen. There's always going to be a tiny minority. But the difference between them being a tiny little cancer cell and then that metastasizing into a much larger problem for the country is by winning the working class and keeping the working class out of their hands. Because the reason why they had 5,000 members is because they didn't have any working class members. They were all intellectuals. They were all dorks. They all taught at Columbia University, or they were all journalists. The reason why they've grown now is because they have made inroads not only to immigrant communities, but to working class communities. So the job of the right should be to keep them a small cadre of dorks meeting around in a basement in New York City somewhere.
Yeah, as I like to say, the world's most lavishly funded Marxist book club. That should be the objective there. I completely agree with that. So to help people who will watch this understand how to process the DSA, and comparisons between right and left are always very fraught because they're really not equal opposites. Is there a parallel perhaps between like the Buchananite wing of the Republican Party? Donald Trump is the closest thing we've had maybe ever to a Pat Buchanan style president, right? He's certainly not Pat Buchanan, but he comes really close in a lot of his assumptions and his worldview. When they say Jacksonian, that's kind of what they're channeling. It's a very paleo going back hundreds of years in some cases. But that movement was very fringe, very minority, and it's now taken over pretty much the entire Republican Party. And even the Republican Party apparatus, which I know does not actually like it, go figure, in Washington, they have to at least bow and genuflect to it in public, right? Is that, I realize it's a limited comparison, but did that come closest to what the DSA's objective is?
That's a perfect comparison. That's exactly what their objective is. Because when they gain, basically you have like a David Hogg as an example.
Yeah, camera hog. Yeah.
Right. Their goal is for someone like him to eventually become the Democratic Party chair.
That lasted like 5 minutes, but I take your point.
Yeah. He's a very bad vessel to carry on that torch. But someone who is maybe a little bit more better spoken, a little better looking, someone come along and actually carry that torch and unite the left wings, the immigrants, and the Democratic Socialists. And then at the end of the day, the Democratic Party is going to have to bend the knee, the same way the Republican Party had to bend the knee to Donald Trump. You don't have to have a majority, but you have to have a controlling minority, and that's what they're convinced that they can get. And they're incrementally succeeding, winning, having 250 candidates in office, having thousands of candidates on the ballot, having almost 100,000 members in their organizations. They're organized, they're motivated, and they feel like they have the answer to America's working class woes. And it's our job to prove them wrong.
Okay, so as we close out here, this is going full circle. This is why you point out that the DSA and Mamdani, and even AOC by extension, represent a lethal threat to the America First Coalition, because the America First Coalition has the best winning argument in political terms that anybody's ever had. I put my country first. So there's no trump card to that. The DSA is equally populist. It's equally willing to challenge the status quo of the powers that be in Washington right now in the uniparty, let's call it, the Republican Democrat establishment that are really like this. It's capable of doing that because it appeals to exactly the same audience. You mentioned working class. I also think young men, and by extension young women, that is a huge part of this. And they go together, obviously, but pointing out, we could easily lose Gen Z 25-year-old men who are really looking for a place they fit in, a sense of purpose and national destiny that's bigger than just me. So this is actually a problem, I think, for older generations that tend to think more individualistically.
Mm-hmm.
You have to understand, you may not like it, but millennials and Zoomers and probably Gen Alpha, my kids, are collectivist in their thinking. Not communist collectivist, but we think about the group. We tend to move at the pace of the slowest member. It's a herd mentality as opposed to a John Wayne mentality. That ain't going anywhere. That's the future. And actually, it's also the past because that's the greatest generation. That's how they won two wars against two major global empires, built the entire public infrastructure system as we know it, conquered the Great Depression, et cetera. So you're pointing out, we might look like we're winning, but it could easily flip into a big majority the other direction if we take that for granted.
Right. If young adults don't feel like America is working for them, a lot of them are going to ask, why should I work for America? Why not just become an internationalist and support the working class, the global working class, as opposed to my country? And, it's true that older generations thought a little bit more individualistically, but I think if we reword it, they were collectively anti-communist.
That's true.
We had a collective goal, and that was surviving the Soviet Union and ultimately, under Reagan, defeating the Soviet Union.
And that was really well articulated in the 50s and 60s.
Correct, yes.
They just used platitudes. They really pointed out, with video, this is what it's like in Moscow right now. Do you want that here? We can do that again.
So we had a national mission and a national goal, which was preserving the American way of life. And that form of nationalism, and here is the key when it comes to immigrants, is there's no immigrant group that can't assimilate. But you have to cut off the source of the immigration. You have to stop their brethren from joining them in their enclaves. You have to cut that off and give them time to assimilate. And eventually, democratic socialism will lose its luster because a lot of these immigrants, they're not socialists, they're identitarians. And socialism offers them a seat at the table. So because of that, they join the DSA or they support socialism. If they don't have any more, if all contact is cut off, immigration contact from their native country, their children and grandchildren are going to grow up Americans, and then it's going to be much easier to assimilate them into the American way of life.
Let's say you're a Syrian immigrant. You're a father, you've got children, you're living here. Do you like the idea of living in the House of Islam, right? Of course you do. Right? Meaning the Muslim world. Of course you do. Would you like to see Islamic banners in America? Yeah, I think that's a fair statement. But is that what your number one concern is day to day? No, you know what it actually is? It's losing your children to, decadent Western capitalism.
Yep.
And in one generation, that happens like this. And that's a power that the right has. My closing question to you, and I'm going to throw this out here, I want to hear what your thoughts are. The left has disadvantages that the right has baked into it, advantages that the right has baked into it. One of it is the left is always anti-patriotic. It has a hard time both criticizing the country while also wrapping itself in the country's flag. The right is naturally appealing to young men because it is patriotic. It honors ancestry. It honors things like this. And one of the United States' advantages is that you don't even have to have ancestors in the country to be a part of that whole national mission, right? To say, my fate is your fate, even if I just got here 5 minutes ago and got my citizenship, but you've been here 4 centuries. Mm-hmm. That's a unique power that the United States has. And it's where the traditional idea of we're an idea and not a nation, and those are probably misapplying it, but they're coming from the same kind of place. So as we stand here in 2026, it seems to me that the right isn't taking advantage of those baked-in advantages enough. Or am I wrong? Or, in other words, how do you see the left and the right stacked up? Are they equal opposites in this field? And if they're not, what are the left's advantages and disadvantages and the equivalent on the right?
Well, on the patriotic question, the left does have an advantage because the right isn't entirely united in their definition of an American.
Interesting.
A lot of them think that an American is someone who believes in the free market and the Constitution. And other people believe that an American is someone who is born here and identifies as an American national. So there's a little bit of a tension on the right that the left feeds into. And ultimately, the only way to defeat the left's view of America as this place where people from different countries and cultures come and they maintain their little ethnic islands and their little cultural islands is for the right to completely unite behind the nationalism that Pat Buchanan and Donald Trump have put forward, which is that America is a nation state with its own people. Donald Trump's grandparents were all born in Scotland and Germany.
Yeah.
I don't think he's ever even visited the town that his grandfather came from. It's not
right.
He didn't even call himself German until the 80s. He called himself Swedish because of the connotations of World War II. So he was an American. He's always identified as an American, even though his grandparents came here as recent arrival. And so that's the attitude and mentality that the right has to embrace, is that you are an American, whether your ancestry goes back to Plymouth or whether your ancestry goes back to the Vietnam War. And so that's a huge issue, and it takes unity on the right. And unfortunately, right now, there isn't unity on the right in the definition of what an American really is, and the left is really eating us alive because of that.
Well, don't you think it's a both and kind of thing? Because I don't think of people who may have ancestors who are on the Mayflower, but are fundamentally anti-American against every one of my values and beliefs that I hold. I don't think of them as equally American to somebody who may actually be the children of immigrants who does see the world the way that I do. Maybe that's just me, but I really don't think of them as my compatriots versus people who share the same worldview and values, even if their ancestry is goes back to a different continent a few generations ago.
What would they be if they're not American?
Well, because it's a different country. Right now, the left and the right in America, despite the internal divisions, are functioning as two different peoples with two different destinies. That's the Civil War aspect right here. Maybe it doesn't end in two different countries splitting apart from one another, but the left does not conceive of the right as misguided fellow Americans. And the right, for the most part, I don't think conceives of the left as misguided Americans either. What do you think?
No, I disagree with that. I think that anyone, regardless of their politics, if they're American, they're American. Like if they identify as an American,
sure,
and nothing else, I mean, they're not another nationality. They're not another ethnicity. So even if they're a socialist, or even if they're ignorant on politics, they're still an American. Like ultimately, this is their nation. This is their country. And it's our job to correct a lot of times they're just misguided. And that's the thing. You got to understand, when people are in K through 12 in our university system, they're brainwashed with leftist propaganda from the time that they first learn how to read. Yeah. So a lot of people, they're just repeating and believing what they've been taught their entire life. They've never actually seen the other side to issues. So a lot of these people are just misguided.
Yeah. No, I agree. And that's where the understanding of the culture war as a civil war is really useful, because a civil war is two different visions of this. It's basically a battle over control over the same land, right? It's not a war of independence where you want one group to leave. I think that's why the secessionist movement on the right that's been proposed is really fringe and won't go anywhere, because most conservatives look at every square inch of the country. I mean, I do. Almost everybody does, and say, that's the United States. That's my people.
Right.
The ideas that are put forward on the left are not native to the country, I guess is what I'm trying to explain. And so people who hold to it, it's like a foreign invasion.
I agree with that. Yes, and a good example is, let's say, for instance, the Bolsheviks, the ethnic Russian Bolsheviks. They never stopped being Russian. They were Russian till the day they died. But because of the foreign ideology that was imported into Russia, they ended up rejecting their history, rejecting their heroes. They tore down the statues of their great heroes from the past because they viewed that as barbaric, and they wanted to bring in, a new society for a new man. They were still Russian. And when you look at it from an ethnic and national standpoint, they never stopped being Russian. That's the thing with these misguided Americans. They're still American. They're still going to be American even if they convert to socialism. Michael Harrington, he was an American. That's the way I see it.
Yes, that's right. That's right. Well, Jacob Grandstaff, thank you for your time and insights today.
Thank you. Thanks so much for having me. Appreciate it.
I'm Hayden Ludwig, and this is Restoration Spotlight, a project of Restoration News, your source of headline-smashing investigative journalism for the America First movement. Check us out at restoration-news.com. And until next time, stay vigilant and trust in God.